but I still have to refuel somewhere. We've been leaving Kiev for 4 hours already.
Well, Joe Biden has also condemned the Russian operation and unveiled what he called a devastating set of sanctions. Caleb Maupin has more.
Well, when we heard from Joe Biden, the U.S. president, he laid out new sanctions on Russia. He spoke specifically of some banks that will be targeted. He specifically talked of products being outlawed to export to Russia. U.S. companies will not be able to export certain products to Russia. Later in the press conference, he was pressed about the SWIFT international banking system. And he gave kind of a mild answer and said, well, the European allies don't seem to agree, and essentially admitted that while the United States might want to kick Russia out of the SWIFT system, it seems the United States is not going to be able to do that at this time. Now, the narrative that Joe Biden laid out throughout his remarks was the same narrative we've been hearing from U.S. officials all along. Apparently, this whole crisis, according to Joe Biden, has just happened simply because of Russia. There is no other factor. It is simply Russia's malign activities that has caused the whole thing. This is what we heard from Joe Biden laying out his interpretation of events.
For weeks, we have been warning that this would happen, and now it's unfolding largely as we predicted.
Now, it's important to note that Russia has repeatedly raised the issue of its security guarantees. In addition to that, Russia has made clear it has no intent to invade Ukraine. However, at this point, they are engaging in an operation to protect the people of Donetsk and Lugansk and make sure they do not continue to face the shelling and bombardment they have been enduring for the past 8 years. It's important to note that, unlike what Joe Biden said, these republics were not declared by the Russian president, Vladimir Putin. They were declared by the peoples of these regions in response to the U.S. coup in 2014, and it has been 8 years since then that Russia has waited to declare the republics. Now, what was also interesting is when pressed by reporters, Joe Biden revealed some rather interesting lack of knowledge when it comes to events. One of the reporters actually asked him, is Putin threatening a nuclear strike? To which Biden replied, I don't know what he is threatening. So we have the president of the United States saying he doesn't know if nuclear war is on the table. Now, of course, Russia has not threatened a nuclear strike. Nuclear war is simply not on the table. Russia is engaging in an operation to protect Donetsk and Lugansk from attack. The idea that this is some kind of nuclear confrontation is pretty outrageous. But the fact that Biden responded to such a question with I don't know is something that a lot of Americans have got to find very concerning.
A European reaction has been pouring in since the start of the Russian operation in Ukraine. Paula Slier breaks it down.
The president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, has said that Putin chose to bring war back to Europe. Now, this is factually incorrect. You need to remember, of course, that the war has been ongoing since 2014. So that's 8 years. And the Western media and Western diplomats are at fault for not pointing that out. In fact, in the last 4 years, so if we're looking at just simply from 2018 alone, there have been 381 civilians who have been killed in the Donbas region, and that is according to United Nations figures. This is 5 times more than the number of people who have been killed in territories that are controlled by Kiev. And the vast majority of these people who've been killed, in fact, over 80%, are in these 2 republics who have declared independence. This is what Ursula von der Leyen had to say.
Children are dying of fear for their lives. We condemn this barbaric attack and the cynical arguments to justify it. It is President Putin who is bringing war back to Europe.
Now, we have received a leaked text regarding this EU meeting that's currently underway, and it says that EU leaders will call for sanctions also to be imposed against Belarus for supporting Russia in this military action. Joseph Borrell, who is the High Representative of the EU for Foreign Affairs, made these comments.
President of the European Council, President Michel, has called for a meeting of the European Council this evening, and they will agree and provide political guidance to adopt the stronger package the harshest package of sanctions we have ever implemented. This is not a question of blocks. This is not a question of diplomatic power games. It's a matter of life and death.
Earlier, the G7 met virtually, and they said that they were appalled by unprovoked and unjustified attacks by Russia. They said that this military action was preceded by fabricated claims and unfounded allegations. The G7 saying that this has fundamentally changed the Euro-Atlantic security situation, and that they too will bring forward severe and coordinated economic and financial sanctions.
Well, not all public figures support the mass condemnation of Russia. Australian journalist John Pilger thinks Western politicians have at least some share in the blame.
The hypocrites on parade. Watch them on CNN, the BBC, read them wall to wall. Now imagine a strategic enclave of Britons, or French, or Germans, or Americans under violent siege, shelled and terrorized, for 8 years. Would this be tolerated by the rulers of the world?
And NATO has condemned
the hypocrites on parade. Watch them on CNN, the BBC, read them wall to wall. Now imagine a strategic enclave of Britons, or French, or Germans, or Americans under violent siege, shelled and terrorized, for 8 years. Would this be tolerated by the rulers of the world?
And NATO has condemned the Russian operation, calling it a horrifying attack on Ukraine, which is entirely unjustified and unprovoked. Political analyst Nikola Murkovic thinks the Western alliance is in no position to accuse others of aggression.
If you look at Brown University's analysis of American and NATO strikes since the 9/11 attacks in New York, we're counting today more than 900,000 dead. We're counting over 50 to 60 million refugees across the world. And these are wars and the consequences of NATO-led and US-led wars across the world. And Jens Stoltenberg is going to give lessons today on what the heinous acts are. I think this is really something that he should refrain from saying. I think this is just a lot of rhetoric, as we've seen coming out from NATO. I think it's positive news that NATO said that it will not intervene, but we must bear in mind that these past years, and since 2014, and the US NATO-led coup in Kiev, leading to an anti-Russian government. This is extremely important that we always bear this in mind. We've seen counselors, we've seen weapons, we've seen funding coming out of NATO countries into Ukraine to finance an army which is fighting against Russian-speaking people of Ukraine. So it's good that NATO does not intervene directly in this specific war, but NATO is also, since these past years, has been intervening in Ukraine and has been encouraging Ukraine to attack the Russian speakers of Donbass. So I think this is something also we should bring to mind to Mr. Stoltenberg.
Now, the Minsk agreements obliged both sides of the Ukrainian conflict to withdraw weapons from the front line. And an RT documentary follows the lives of people living in the conflict zone over the past 8 years. You can see the full version at RT.com. A warning though to viewers, you may find some of the following scenes distressing.
Alexander Leontievich is one of the Grey Zone's most popular residents. He's the only electrician still here after civil war broke out in the settlement of Alexandrovka. For him, the front line starts just outside the gates of his own house.
И на Шевченко вчера тут 11 числа вызывали, то 10 числа я был. Там перебиты были провода, сделал. Тоже на лестнице пришлось лазить.
А чем перебили?
Ну, работает снайпера и с крупнокалиберных каждый божий день.
Alexander keeps a special notebook where he records every one of his calls to repair power lines damaged by shelling. In the last 7 years, it's become a real chronicle of an undeclared war.
9.05 обстреляли Александровку с пулемета в 6:00 утра. Не было света, перебиты провода от столба к дому. 13.05. После него был обстрел шахты 10. Поселок 16:00. И там убило человека, сгорел дом. Нет! Да!
Давай сюда. блокпост. Боков, по одному. Давай на коп. Попали. Потушить бы ее как-то. А как ты ее потушишь?
There's no entry in Alexander's diary for January the 16th, 2015. That was the day his family was killed by mortar fire.
Взрыв там, где я был на даче. Там нас было три человека, майор и с полиции, гаишник и товарищ по соседству, то же самое. Первый взрыв получился там, где мы были, но только вовремя мы отключились. Отключился я. И сразу упал за забором. Ну, длинный забор высокий, тот высокий. Где-то 2 метра и шлакоблока выложенный. Мы только зашли в дом, через минут 10 второй взрыв. Через минут 7-8 мне звонит Солидара, что погиб мой сын, невестка и парень. Когда я прибежал, увидел, это вам не передать.
Well, those are the headlines for this hour here on RT International. We're back in 30 minutes with all the latest headlines, including on that crisis in Ukraine. We're back at midnight Moscow time. Join us again then.
The world is driven by dreamers, shaped by thinkers and those with vision.
Who dares, thinks. We dare to ask.
Is your media a reflection of reality? In a world transformed, what will make you feel safer? Isolation or community? Are you going the right way or are you being led somewhere? Which direction?